Hi everyone, yeah, I'm Rhys Hobbs, I'm the Environmental Resilience and Adaptation Manager, quite a long title. Essentially, that means that for the council, my team and my role is dealing with the Lead Local Flood Authority and Coastal Protection Authority duties. So very linked in terms of what we've been talking about today in terms of shoreline management and Bude. Declaration, I do live in Bude as well, so I have another interest in terms of kind of the how Bude ends up developing in terms of for the future. So I'm going to talk about the context of local policy. I'm sorry, that's after lunch and it is local policy and it can be a bit dry, but I will try and keep it entertaining. But the first bit I just wanted to talk about is what we've been terming essentially for Cornwall as the environmental challenge. So we have the climate emergency declaration, which was made, and you heard from my colleague Nick Hayden, I think, at the last session about our need to reduce emissions and how that impacts on how the climate will change. We've got the declaration of the ecological emergency and the impact that's already been had and kind of impact to nature and ecology, and how that will be further potentially worsened by a changing climate. And then more what I'm here to talk about, which is adaptation, and it's linked to, I'm just going to pick out what Hert said earlier on in terms of, I'm not going to call it solutions either, I'm going to call it adaptive solutions, because I don't think there is one answer to what we need to do to address the issues of sea level rise and coastal erosion impacts in Bude and across Cornwall. So I'll talk a little bit about the adaptation strategy as well. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but essentially what I'm trying to just talk about is the science that underpins much of the work that we've done to look at the risk to Bude comes from the global projections, the UK projections, work done at a regional level, and then very bespoke work that's been done to look at Cornwall specifically. So in terms of the risk that we're looking at and identifying to Bude, it's not based on something that is global. It is, but it's very specific as well in terms of bespoke for Cornwall. And these, I don't know how well you can all see this, but these are some of the main impact predictions that we've seen from that risk assessment work. And you can kind of see the dial on the left there in terms of the more emissions that we make, the higher those temperatures go, the worse these impacts are going to be, with increased coastal erosion and sea level rise being one of those key ones that we've identified for Cornwall and for Bude specifically, because obviously we've been talking about Bude being one of the main risk locations. Now, and those sea levels having risen over the last 15 centimetres over the last 100 years, essentially, and that projection that was talked about earlier. Now, in terms of what we're able to do, we've developed the risk assessment work, which I mentioned. There is the adaptation strategy, which is very much setting out, and this is the opportunity for the jury to be able to feed in. It's one that's perhaps not listed on the information that Rob has provided, but it's very much an opportunity in terms of the jury to set out perhaps how they want to see Bude and Cornwall adapt to climate risks. So that's something that's being developed. And then as part of that, working to develop an adaptation plan with the community across all climate risks. We're here today to talk about sea level rise and coastal erosion, but that is one of those risks that will feature in there. Now, the way that happens on a kind of local context is it will be implemented largely through the local neighbourhood development plan. NDP has been bandied around quite a lot today, and a coastal change management plan, which is how you would look to designate, if the jury saw fit to rate that recommendation, look at designating a coastal change management area for Bude, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And I suppose linking that back, that is all then able to play into the local plan, which filters down into the local planning process, essentially. So when you have planning applications for particular sites and how we plan strategically. I won't talk too much about this. It's just, I think what I'm trying to highlight here is that adaptation strategy work is looking at how all the different agencies, like Justin was talking about, are involved in planning for climate change at an organisational and strategic level, but then working with yourselves as the jury at a community level, and also you're all individuals here as well, in terms of how we can plan for that. So there's various examples of different types of adaptation already happening in Cornwall, but obviously we're talking here specifically about Bude, and one of those being the Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I think we're talking about solutions or adaptive solutions. I want to talk about one that's already in existence for Cornwall and for Bude, We mentioned the climate emergency DPD, which came in February. What that does is it essentially sets out, you can hopefully make it out, the orange zone around the whole of Cornwall's coastline in terms of coastal vulnerability risk. And that is areas that will be at risk from both coastal flooding to a certain extent and sea level rise and erosion. And that essentially is already part of the planning process. We consider that through the DPD. So these zones here, as part of when a planning application is made, we will look at a development and see whether what the level of risk is, and we can make recommendations or object potentially, if necessary, to the development on those grounds. And that can also be further reinforced by the CCM, the Coastal Change Management Area. Sorry, I'm already dropping into acronyms there. And basically, essentially, what that is it's making sure that any new development perhaps doesn't occur in an area that is at risk or is going to be at risk in the future over the next 100 years, which is kind of what you can see these different zones are here. So is it going to be safe? Are people building in an area that's likely to fall into the sea in the next 10 years? Is it sustainable? I'm not going to answer that question again because I think Justin did a really good job of answering what we mean by that in terms of development. But is it strategic? Are we building something here that means that in the next 20 years, we can't roll back something that is potentially at more risk further forward to that location because we've put, I don't know, a shopping centre there or something like that. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but that's the concept I'm trying to get across. So it's about how we plan the local area in the context of coastal risk, essentially. Cool, thank you. So in terms of the coastal change management areas, it was mentioned earlier on, I'll probably address it now in terms of Newquay has designated one. It is the only one that we have in Cornwall currently, but there is the opportunity for the jury to if they're minded to recommend that would be a potential way of addressing coastal risk within Cornwall. And essentially, I know it's very wordy on this slide, hopefully that's only a really wordy one I've got, but the principle of a CCMA is to make sure that we are, as I described on the slide before, not having development that is either unsafe or it is preventing our ability to develop elsewhere in the future and locking in areas, or what we call squeezing, or coastal squeeze, essentially. So there's, I suppose the one final thing I wanted to say on CCMAs is that they do, and it's important because the question came up earlier as well, is they do give the more weight within the planning process. So if an objection was raised, or if the town council or you as individuals were responding to a planning application that is happening in a location that's at risk, it basically gives greater weight to when the planning officer is considering that, whether they would like, what determination they make in terms of whether something is allowed to happen or not. Now, the one thing I'd need to point out with that as well, because it came up earlier, is that does not mean that it won't happen. Planning officers have lots of things to consider as part of their decision making, and they have to consider everything in what they call the planning balance. So it's how beneficial they think whatever the application is may benefit Bude, outweighing potentially the coastal risk. So it's just one thing to really highlight is it gives you more. It's a more powerful tool to be able to raise concerns around those, but it doesn't mean that the development may not happen, which is why you get a lot of people say, oh, well, I've objected to something in a flood risk area, yet the house has still been built, for example. So it doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it is a very powerful tool in terms of being able to make sure the coastline is developed safely and securely. Final section I just want to talk on in relation to is CTAP. So coastal. People love their acronyms, don't they, right? It's the Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme. That is one part of various different bits of funding that's available for flood risk and coastal erosion protection, adaptation. We've historically been very focused on building defences. There's a lot of reasons why that, as Justin's pointed out, is perhaps not considered sustainable anymore. I have probably 40 communities in Cornwall that are at risk of coastal flooding and coastal erosion in the near future. to a certain extent, just not enough money to go around all of those to be able to do be able to protect every community. It's also not technologically feasible to do that. We can build walls, but in some instances, those walls need to be, I don't know, 4 or 5 meters high, which obviously drastically changes the view of the coastline. So what the CTAP program is looking at is how we can move that infrastructure. So in terms of the Bude context specifically, talking about things like the car park. That area is potentially at risk currently. It wouldn't, through the projections that you've all seen, will potentially, if we don't do anything, will not be there in the next 20, 30 years, essentially. Similarly with some of the infrastructure that's there, like the toilet block, the RNLI building. So CTAP is the opportunity to essentially look at how we can strategically or better plan how we can move some of those assets that are there that serve both the community and others in a better way. So it may be that part of the car park is decommissioned, but as part of that, you have to think, we can't just lose the car parking space because it's going to impact tourism potentially or local people's ability to park there. So what's the other option for where we can then put that car parking within Bude, essentially? Similarly with things like the RNLI building, if you look to move that, they still need to be able to operate to be able to keep people safe. So they can't be Stratton Way, it needs to be somewhere near the coast, so you need to look at where the other opportunities to do that are. And that is what CTAP will look to do, focus specifically around Summerlees. But it doesn't mean that we've already determined, or it's already been determined, what is going to happen with any of that. That's what the next part of the process in terms of delivering a business case to, as Justin said, make sure it's economic, how it works for economics, but essentially that it focuses on the principle of making sure that things that are there are not at the continuing risk, and we plan for them now rather than getting 20 years down the line and thinking, oh, there's a real problem here. The RNLI can't get the boats out to deploy them in the water to save people, essentially. I'm not going to go through these because I know that you've seen them all already, and they're probably quite hard to make out. So I've kind of talked about that on the previous slide, but essentially this is just highlighting those points around looking at potentially moving those public facilities and emergency services facilities, looking at adaptive design as well. Do we need to put the buildings that we're moving, or potentially going to move, back in the same way? Can we make them more adaptive in terms of a climate solution? They may need property flood resilience boards, things like that. Or it may be that certain of them are able to be mobile units that can be moved. So nothing's been determined like that, but that's the type of thinking that there is around what you could do around changing the makeup of Summerlees to allow that dune network to better establish, essentially, and better protect the area behind it. Final slide, it was just in summary, so I've talked about the wider adaptation strategy. That's an opportunity for the jury to consider and think about when they're making recommendations in terms of how Cornwall adapts to climate risk. The local policy, I've talked about the DPD, as the notes you've had said, there's less ability to influence that because it's already been implemented and it functions, I think, pretty well so far, although we won't see the effects of some of that until new development comes through. The Bude local policy, which is very much the opportunity for the jury in terms of that CCMA designation, potentially, and also feeding into the CTAP project. So I've given examples of what might be the art of the possible there, but there is the opportunity for the jury to consider what they would like to see changes at Summerlees look like and what they think the wider community might want to see, whilst ensuring that we've reduced the risk to the site, but also still have reduced the impacts to the community in general.